So let's talk about pressing seam allowances on curves. So I like to press my seam allowances open for a couple of reasons. And the first reason is that it eliminates a lot of bulk in this kind of seam. If you are sewing multiple curved units together, then this little point has a lot of fabric coming together. And if you were to press this seam allowance to, let's say, the outside, the crust portion of your little circle unit, then you already have 3 pieces of fabric here. And if you were to join that to another piece where the pieces are pressed to the outside. So once you piece these two together and kind of press your new seam allowance to the side, then you have quite a lot of fabric in this kind of crust area on whichever side you press it to. This time it's on this left side here. So when I flip it over, there are 6 layers of fabric that you're going to have to stitch through when you go to do your free motion quilting. So let's say you are zooming along doing some type of dot to dot. Here you're going through just 1 layer of fabric, and then all of a sudden you have this kind of hump where you go from 1 layer of fabric up, and you can see how my little tool here is really kind of jumping over this big lump of fabric. It's going to be a lot harder for your needle to go through. It might kind of wobble your free motion quilting line a little bit, and it's just not going to lay as super flat as kind of the rest of your block. This kind of extra width that this block is taking up by kind of bending around all those layers of fabric is also going to have a little bit of an impact on your accuracy from block to block. On a block this size, these are 6-inch curves. It's not going to be as drastic, but if you are using little tiny curves, then that little width of fabric is a larger percentage of the overall size of the block. And so it's going to start to make this side, this side that's kind of carrying the load of the seam, it is going to be shorter than this side over here because this side has to bend around all of those layers of fabric. So let's press this block with the fabric towards the pie piece. Now this looks like a nice smooth curve, but if you kind of tug on it, you can see that there's some extra fabric caught in that press. Now, I've done it a little dramatically here, but if you turn your blocks to the side and there's like a little bit of an extra fold here, if you kind of pull it apart and it changes, then you are trapping some fabric, some kind of like a little flap of fabric in the seam allowance of your block. It's harder to see when you are pressing your seam allowances to one side. Like it looks fine from this side, it looks nice and smooth from this side, but there's that extra fabric trapped in there. Now, catching that extra fabric when you're pressing, if you're pressing open, it's just a lot harder to do this. And so you kind of alleviate this problem of kind of caught fabric. So let's talk about seam nesting, because I know a lot of you are seam nesters, and that is a great thing to do in some blocks. And by nesting, I mean you are going to press some of your seam allowances to one direction and some of them to the other direction, so that when you match them up, you have this nice little locking action. So I have pressed these 2 curves in opposite directions. This one is pressed towards the kind of pie piece, and this one is pressed towards the crust piece. Now, what is unique about curved piecing is this kind of 3D effect you get from the piecing. And it really starts to show up when you piece kind of multiples together, but you can see it here. On this block, the kind of pie piece is really popping up. It almost feels like it's appliqued or kind of sitting on top of the background piece. Whereas here, the background piece, because there is this little shadow kind of from the background piece onto the circle is kind of receding and this white is kind of popping out. You can manipulate that in your design depending on what you want to kind of come to the forefront or go to the background. But when you mix these styles to nest seams, it's not the best looking thing. I'm sure that it sews together really nicely, but you have these kind of uneven feeling circles. Whereas on this block, this seam is pressed open and this circle part and the background part are really on the same plane. They kind of smoothly integrate into each other. So how do we do it? I have my unpressed little circle unit here, and I'm going to kind of put it down, and then I like to kind of grab the pie piece and just kind of drag it a little bit. And that really helps flip that seam out. And then once it's down, I smooth it a little bit and I grab my iron and I just start pressing out. And I'm just making sure that that seam is first being pressed to the background. I'm lifting my iron a little bit as I move it. I'm not lifting it all the way, but I'm relieving some of the pressure as I move it, and then I put it back down and give it a little press. Now that the seam is pressed to the outside, we're gonna flip it over, and now we're gonna press it open. I kind of angle it so it's kind of square on me, and I start at one side. I put my little finger in there, and I use my finger to press the seam open. Sometimes you can get your fingernail in there and almost kind of scratch it a little bit, and that'll get it really nice and flat. Kind of drag your fingernail and follow with the iron. And I go until I'm about halfway, and I stop here because if I continue rotating around the curve, then the kind of butt end of my iron is going to start rotating this way. And it's going to catch this part of the seam and kind of drag it, and it's probably going to fold it back. And we're going to press a kind of a wonky crease into this side of our seam allowance. So I just rotate it and pick it back up and finish off that seam. And then I can kind of pick up the end of my iron, rotate it back on, and give one good solid downward press to this seam. And give it a second. And then I can flip it over, and I just kind of run my fingers along that seam. It's very hot. If your fingers are not as kind of heat proof as mine, this is the Clover, I think it's called the Iron Finger, and this is a temperature proof kind of little nylon nub, and you can kind of use that in place of your finger if you need a little more heat protection than I do. But I can kind of smooth it down. I can feel that the seams are smooth and all going kind of out instead of flipped. You'd be able to kind of feel that weird texture. And then I give it one good press. My fabric is pretty nicely starched, but if you want to give it another little spritz with your starch or best press, then this is a great time to do it when you're doing it kind of from the front. And now we have a super duper flat block here. Now, because your curves are going to be cut on the bias, there's plenty of ease in this fabric for it to kind of curve around this curved piece and lie flat to the inside and the outside all at once. So now if I were to go and join this to another block, these seams are already pressed open. So I would sew my seam to join it to another block, and then I would press that seam open as well, so that I would only have 4 layers of fabric kind of folded this way, and it would lie much flatter and be easier to free motion quilt and have that nice really flat appearance that I'm going for. I hope you guys enjoyed this little quick tip, and I'll see you again soon.